13, number 9. Consider the diagram below in which the current short-run equilibrium is at point A and answer the questions that follow. First, we're going to say what type of gap exists at point A. So I've tried to copy the model on my handy whiteboard here. I think I have it right. So at point A, what type of gap do we have? There's the A right there. Well, we're below our potential level of output, so we have a recessionary gap. That's the answer to A, it's recessionary gap. People are unemployed because we're not making as much stuff, so unemployment is high, output is down. Then letter B, if the marginal propensity to save equals 0.2, what change in government spending financed by borrowing from the private sector could eliminate the gap identified in part A? So he actually, I don't think we need this piece about borrowing from the private sector. It's just referring to government spending. We don't explore anything about crowding out or anything like that in this question. I think that makes it a little bit more confusing. What I find challenging here is to figure out, like, with what's given down here, how much does aggregate demand need to rise in order to close that gap? Because the gap is $500 billion or $500 billion in output, right? 18.5 to 19. But in order to close that gap, we need to aggregate demand to be raised back to here. So our determinants of aggregate demand were CI, G, and NX. So we're really just talking about increasing G in order to get this gap to close after the multiplier effect ripples through consumption as well. Okay, so we want to close this gap, move aggregate demand back up to here. Down here we can see the measure is $500 billion. But to close the gap by $500 billion would only move this halfway there. How can I describe this better? To get this intersection to be back up here, we need to get back up to this price level as well. That's where we expect to be. And so at that price level, aggregate demand, the total amount that would be demanded at the old price level is only 18 trillion. We need to raise aggregate demand by 1 trillion. We can see that at the gap at the old price level. That's how much we are actually shy on aggregate demand at the old price level. Our recessionary gap is here, but at lower prices, we've only fallen $500 billion. So to achieve our outcome, the intended aim has to be to close the gap $1 trillion. 18 to 19, because that's the gap that we can see up here at the old price level. In order to make that happen, to get $1 trillion gap closed with a multiplier of, what was it, 5? Oops. Yeah, it is. We're given the MPS is equal to 0.2. The MPS is 0.2. So what is the multiplier? The multiplier is equal to 1 over the MPS, which is equal to 1 over 0.2, which is equal to 5. So 5 times what initial expenditure equals the change in our GDP that we're looking for, which is equal to 1 trillion, because that's the total amount we have to make up to get aggregate demand to shift, not just like to here, but we want to get back up to there. So that at that price level, that gap was that trillion right there. And 5 times what initial expenditure will equal $1 trillion. $1 trillion divided by 5 is 200 billion. Or 0.2 trillion, which is $200 billion. So I just divided $1 trillion by 5. 5 times what equals 1 trillion. I think the hard part is seeing that this is the gap. But now that I've marked it up, let me go ahead and say this is what we're trying to achieve, is this closure. And so the gap in output is a half trillion, but we want to raise demand. Another way to look at it is at 115, how much would be the quantity demanded? Would be a trillion more at the same price level. But by doing that, the price level will go up. And so to close a $500 billion debt and get us back to where we started, we need to close, you can think of it as this gap or this gap, which is $1 trillion wide. So I hope that helps. In an earlier question, we had aggregate supply and aggregate demand discussed. So hopefully seeing this again has clarified that a little bit.